There are two images that emerged from the past few weeks during the longest government shutdown in American history that I just can't get out of my head. The first is a video, or maybe a photo, of a line. It's one of those long, winding queues that snakes around a corner, the kind you'd see for a blockbuster. But these people aren't waiting for a movie. They're waiting for food. This is a food pantry, and the line is suddenly this long because, with the government shut down, the administration had just refused to release funds for food stamps. 1 in 8 Americans depend on that program. There was even a court order, which the government reportedly resisted, fighting at every step to not pay out the benefits. Then there's the second image. This one was posted by the president himself on social media. It's a photo of a bathroom. Not just any bathroom, but the newly renovated one in the Lincoln bedroom. And it is gleaming. You see the polished marble walls, the shining, almost glittering gold hardware. It's a picture of pure, deliberate opulence. And the thing that gets me, the thing that sticks, is that these two pictures, the line for food and the golden faucet, they weren't just from the same country. They were from the same week. It was this perfect, jarring split screen of two different worlds, presented as if one had nothing to do with the other.
It's an incredibly powerful juxtaposition. And you're exactly right. I mean, it captures the raw ethical dimension of this whole political moment. On one side, you have this fundamental human need for food, and it's being leveraged, as a political bargaining chip. And then on the other side, you have celebrated luxury, a clear focus on the elite.
Right.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to move past the immediate shock of those optics. We need to get beyond just the symbolism, and we need to unpack the federal policies, the economic fallout, and, I think crucially, the underlying political architecture that allowed that precise split screen to even exist.
Absolutely, because the superficial explanation you always hear is, oh, it's just government gridlock or, maybe political incompetence.
Yeah.
When you actually dig in, it suggests something far more intentional about where the priorities truly lie when the pressure is on.
Precisely. We need to explore that governance challenge and policy consequences. How did we get to a point where the essential federal safety net became so volatile? And maybe the bigger question, why does the reality of the policy, the actual laws being pursued, seem to actively contradict the populist rhetoric that was used to win the election in the first place?
Okay, so for you listening, we've structured our deep dive around 3 critical areas to try and answer those questions. First, we're going to look at the immediate and, honestly, the massive long-term economic costs of disrupting food assistance. We're talking about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. Second, we'll dive into what we're calling the populist paradox, that huge clash between the promise of America First and policies that, in practice, just undeniably favor the wealthy and connected. And finally, we will expose what we can call the architecture of inequality, the systematic, documented way that tax policy and elite influence shape these dramatic choices, guaranteeing that policy keeps diverging from what the public actually wants. So let's jump right into part 1. The shock absorber fails. We're focusing on the immediate and long-term costs of this SNAP disruption. As we mentioned in the opening, the administration fought hard to withhold these funds during the shutdown. I mean, they were using procedural maneuvers, resistance tactics, everything.
The nature of this policy decision was extraordinary, even for a government shutdown. The administration refused to use an existing $5 billion emergency reserve, a reserve fund that was explicitly designated to cover benefits for programs like SNP.
So the money was there?
The money was there. And when we talk about resisting a court order, that's where the action seemed to become completely unprecedented.
Okay, so a federal court orders the distribution of the benefits to, avert a humanitarian crisis. Why the resistance? I mean, was there any official argument beyond the rhetoric for why they fought it?
Well, the arguments, as they were reported, focused less on, say, solvency and more on this idea of procedural purity, the idea that allowing the funds to flow would set a precedent, that the courts couldn't force Congress to allocate funds in a specific way, even with the emergency reserve. But what's really crucial here is that reports indicated the administration went further. They reportedly asked states to actively rescind any efforts they had already made to ensure those full benefits were paid out locally.
Wow. So it wasn't passive, it was an active measure.
It was an active measure that, to observers, felt designed to deliberately weaken that fundamental government protection for the most vulnerable people.
And that context is so important because this isn't some niche program. This was affecting 1 in 8 Americans.
Exactly. To understand the gravity of this, we have to internalize the sheer scope of SNAP. It helps close to 40 million Americans. every single month. And the demographic data is incredibly clear. Nearly 90% of recipients are children, the elderly, or people with disabilities.
The most vulnerable populations.
Absolutely. This program is the basic firewall against malnutrition for them, and the average benefit, we have to remember, is so modest. It's about $1.40 per person per meal. It's not luxury, it is just sustenance.
And when that modest but essential sustenance is frozen, the impact is just instantaneous and brutal. We read this account that really drives home the reality of it, this story of a working cashier in Alabama. We can call her Keisha. She relied on S&P to make sure her two kids got things like fresh fruit and milk because her own retail hours were so unpredictable.
And that's where the policy immediately hits. Where people are most vulnerable, their children. This is where the whole discussion shifts from policy into just raw human experience and dignity.
She described the moment the benefits were frozen not just as going hungry, but as intense panic. She talked about having to stretch everything, like watering down her kid's juice just to make it last longer and trying to pass it off as some new kind of drink.
The stress of that is just immense.
And then she had to go to the local food pantry, which, compounding the stress, she found packed, not just with her usual neighbors, but with other people suddenly made vulnerable by the shutdown. Furloughed federal employees, TSA agents, who secure our airports, prison guards.
That story, it just powerfully illustrates two immediate things. First, the swift and immense stress and shame that compromises the dignity of working people like her and her kids. And second, it highlights the broad ripple effect. A political decision aimed at the budget immediately creates dependency for federal workers who are themselves victims of the gridlock and the compromise of children's nutrition specifically. That's what feeds into the much greater, longer-term consequences we're about to get into.
And the weight of this crisis, it just immediately falls onto local governments, community organizations. It isn't contained to the individual home. It becomes a municipal crisis overnight.
That's why the U.S. Conference of Mayors recognized this immediately. They quickly did a nationwide survey, covered 105 cities, to gauge the potential local fallout. And the consensus was unified, alarming, and very, very clear. The federal safety net cannot be replaced by local efforts.
So what did the mayors find specifically? And what was their capacity to absorb this kind of federal failure?
96% of the mayors who responded reported that the impact of the SNAMPA disruption would be very significant or significant on their residents. They detailed overwhelming strain across multiple local systems.
Let's break that down. Where was the pressure felt most acutely in these cities?
The highest strain, cited by 96% of cities, was on food banks and emergency pantries. These are the organizations already operating on razor-thin margins. This disruption meant food banks had to divert resources, struggle to get enough provisions for this sudden surge of 40 million people across the country.
Right.
But the impact wasn't just humanitarian. 91% of cities anticipated significantly decreased spending at local grocery stores and small businesses. And this is a critial point. S&P funds are a vital local economic stabilizer. Cutting them removes commerce directly from Main Street retailers.
That money goes right back into the local economy, stabilizing sales for small businesses.
Precisely. The mayors also projected significant increases in other social costs. They cited potential upticks in low-level crime, greater strain on city emergency budgets, and, this is worrying, increases in eviction filings, as families were forced to divert what little money they had for rent and utilities just to cover food.
And we have some concrete local examples, too, that really quantify this economic vacuum.
Yes. For instance, Phoenix, Arizona. They estimated that 400,000 residents would lose benefits. That is a massive demographic suddenly facing profound food insecurity. Even in a smaller city like Tulsa, Oklahoma, they projected a loss of $32 million in monthly economic activity, money just taken directly out of local registers. The message from city leadership was unified. This is a manufactured crisis, both humanitarian and economic, and local resources are just utterly incapable of managing the catastrophe created by this federal policy failure.
It really sets the stage for a compelling economic argument because the immediate human and local costs are they're devastating. But now let's pivot to the long-term economic calculation. This is where the numbers get truly stunning. And they challenge the entire political premise that cutting S&P is actually saving money.
Right. We have to shift the frame from short-term accounting, the immediate budget ledger, to long-term economic modeling. The initial argument is always presented as simple subtraction. We cut X in benefits, we save X. But sophisticated analysis from Columbia University reveals that society, including the taxpayer, bears massive financial costs down the line. We're talking about intergenerational costs.
And what does that complex economic model, analyzing the impact over a child's entire lifetime, reveal about the true cost-benefit ratio of these cuts?
It reveals a shockingly negative return on investment. The analysis finds that for every single $1 in SNAP cut from families with children, it costs society anywhere from $14 to $20 in net economic losses over time.
Wait, hold on. $14 to $20 in losses for every single dollar supposedly saved. That's not fiscal responsibility.
Yeah.
That's a guarantee of a future economic deficit. How do they even arrive at that staggering ratio? What are the mechanisms of loss they're modeling?
This deep dive into the modeling is essential to understanding the finding. The analysis projects these long-term societal losses by accounting for the entire impact of nutritional deficits on a child's life trajectory. It uses a rigorous discounting methodology, a 2% discount rate model to calculate the present value of future losses. And when you break down that 21 ratio, the specific components of that future loss are incredibly clear.
Okay, so let's start with the largest component of this future financial burden.
The single biggest cost identified is the decreased health and longevity of children who experience these nutritional deficiencies early in life. It amounts to a projected loss of $174.2 billion over the life of the affected cohort. And this is rooted in extensive evidence. It shows that consistent SNAP benefits in early life are strongly linked to improved adult health outcomes. Lower risks of obesity, lower incidence of heart disease, reduced diabetes rates. When you remove that fundamental nutritional support, you are creating massive, persistent future public health burdens and subsequent government healthcare spending.
So inadequate nutrition in the first few years of life is directly converting into colossal healthcare expenses and a diminished quality of life for the next 50 years.
Precisely. And the second largest component of loss directly impacts taxpayers in a different, significant way. Increased expenditures on the criminal legal system. And the victim costs associated with crime. That totals $51 billion.
$51 billion.
Research has consistently shown that early childhood access to nutritional assistance is inversely linked to rates of crime committed later in life. Cutting benefits increases the likelihood of criminal legal involvement and all the massive societal costs that come with it. Enforcement, incarceration, victim support.
That is a huge hidden cost. It almost suggests that starving a program like SNAP is essentially subsidizing future prison costs. Where else do we see major long-term financial consequences?
Well, we see a substantial loss in future economic output. This shows up as decreased future earnings of children due to things like stunted cognitive development and lower educational attainment. That's $69.1 billion in lost productivity. Crucially, children who get consistent early assistance grow up to earn more, which means they contribute more to the economy and pay more in future taxes. When that early assistance is revoked, the model projects they earn less and consequently pay less in future taxes. Another $14.5 billion lost to the Treasury. And the model also accounts for increased healthcare costs for both the kids and their stressed parents, and increased dependency on other social programs in adulthood.
The fiscal irony here is profound, and we need to be precise about the specific policy we're talking about here. This is all based on a potential rollback of the 2021 TFP adjustment. Can you explain what the TFP is and why rolling it back would save $15 billion now but cost us hundreds of billions later?
Absolutely. This technical clarity is paramount. TFP stands for the Thrifty Food Plan. It is the cheapest of 4 food plans from the USDA, representing the bare minimum cost of a healthy diet. For decades, the TFP was not updated to reflect modern nutritional needs or food costs, so SNAP benefits consistently fell short. The 2021 TFP adjustment was a historic move mandated by Congress that increased benefits to more accurately reflect the true cost of a nutritious diet. It was an investment.
Right.
So the short-term goal for those advocating cuts was to roll back this TFP adjustment, which would save an initial $15.1 billion. However, as the Columbia study shows, the resulting long-term loss to society from the subsequent degradation of public health, increased crime, and decreased earnings ranges from $206 billion to $295 billion.
So the economic evidence fundamentally reframes the political debate. It stops being about whether we can afford to fund SNAP, and it becomes an urgent question of whether we can afford not to. The takeaway seems to be that cutting this assistance isn't just cruel, it's fiscally and economically disastrous. It operates at a guaranteed loss of 14 to 20 times the supposed savings.
The data really does speak for itself. It shows a profound policy contradiction. choosing short-term, optically appealing savings at the expense of overwhelming, documented long-term societal costs.
And this overwhelming evidence of long-term economic self-destruction brings us directly to part two, the populist paradox. If the data clearly shows these policy choices are fiscally unsound for the nation as a whole, why would a political movement that rose to power claiming to prioritize the forgotten Americans actively engage in decisions like fighting SNAP funding that demonstrably harm those very constituents, especially when you juxtapose it with images of extreme wealth?
The contrast is so severe that it becomes a central political liability. I mean, the two images you started with, the food line and the golden marble bathroom, they perfectly crystallize this contradiction for the public. It provides opponents with this ready-made narrative of profound inequality.
Let's focus on that clash of rhetoric and opulence. You had the celebrated renovation of the Lincoln bedroom bathroom with its polished marble and gleaming gold hardware posted for the world to see. And at the same time, the administration was hosting these lavish events like a Great Gatsby-themed Halloween party at Mar-a-Lago with the slogan, "A little party never killed nobody."
And these weren't just isolated social events. These optics were deeply intertwined with policy actions. The administration was hosting private dinners for Wall Street executives and billionaires, figures like Jamie Dimon during the shutdown. This communicates a very clear message about who truly holds the president's attention and who is providing political counsel while the government is technically closed and safety nets are being aggressively challenged.
The focus was on wealthy donors.
Exactly, and that stood in stark contrast to the rhetoric of fighting for the common man.
And the policy actions weren't just contradictory at home. There was also a major international decision that seemed to directly violate that core America First promise.
That's the most extraordinary point for the populist base. While the U.S. government was shut down, actively battling in court to withhold food aid from its own most vulnerable citizens, the administration simultaneously approved a massive $20 billion bailout for Argentina. For his loyal base, which had been promised a retreat from foreign entanglements and a laser focus on domestic American issues, this was a significant, undeniable departure.
So the narrative that emerged was one of a president who came to power promising to champion the average voter against the globalist elite, yet whose actions in inner circles seemed utterly aligned with the wealthy elite he campaigned against. And we have evidence that this contradiction started to cause real fractures in his core support.
That's where the perspective of a Pennsylvania hardware store owner becomes so crucial. He represents the kind of voter who embraced that populist message, hoping for relief for small businesses and working families in his community. But he experienced this cognitive dissonance. Watching his community suffer immediate aid cuts, people who worked but still relied on SNAP to stabilize their lives, while simultaneously sharing about massive tax cuts for billionaires and international bailouts.
He realized the core contradiction between the promise and the outcome.
Exactly. He's quoted as realizing that the beautiful rhetoric about forgotten America was for us, but the policy is for them, meaning the wealthy getting tax cuts and international finance getting billion-dollar bailouts. That kind of realization is highly damaging to the foundation of any populist movement. It fundamentally erodes trust.
The loss of faith wasn't just contained to voters. It drew immediate and serious criticism from within the conservative political establishment itself.
Right. That internal backlash signals that the policy choices were causing ideological ruptures. We saw quotes from respected, staunchly conservative figures like Representative Thomas Massie. He criticized the administration's drift, listing a series of actions that alienated the base, including what he called protecting pedophiles, in reference to resisting Epstein disclosures, blowing our budget on non-populist priorities, and starting their wars overseas.
That is highly charged criticism coming from a political ally.
It shows the severity of the ideological betrayal perceived by the base. Another former insider, David LePan, a senior advisor at the VA, felt the president had utterly abandoned his core campaign pledges. He called him an elitist, focused solely on taking care of himself and fellow billionaires and millionaires. LePan pointed out that veterans, who were often the most energized by the populist rhetoric, were now relying on the very food stamps the administration was fighting to cut.
So after these PR disasters and subsequent electoral losses, where Democrats won key races by focusing intensely on the rising cost of living. The administration did a political pivot, scrambling to address affordability.
They absolutely panicked. They tried to hastily recapture the narrative, and the attempts were often clumsy and poorly supported by facts. They wrongly insisted to the public that grocery prices were declining. They floated technically complex but politically vague proposals, like a 50-year mortgage plan, which housing experts immediately dismissed as doing nothing to address the fundamental issues of supply or entry costs.
And what about that proposal of the tariff dividend check? That seemed especially confusing.
It was incredibly convoluted. They floated the idea of a $2,000 tariff dividend check, but Treasury officials later had to significantly walk that back. They clarified that this money could be just the tax decreases that we are seeing on the president's agenda. So they were effectively just repackaging existing or proposed tax cuts that primarily benefited the wealthy into something that sounded like populist relief.
So their policy solution for the affordability crisis was just more of the same policy that was actively making the crisis worse in the first place.
That is the ultimate policy failure when you measure it against the stated goal of affordability. When we examine the specific policies that were actively making life less affordable, they directly contradicted the goal of supporting working families.
Let's detail that list. How did their trade policies hurt grocery costs?
Well, start with grocery costs. The administration's extensive use of tariffs was actively ballooning the prices of everything from rice to Halloween candy, because those taxes on imports are almost always passed directly to the American consumer. It wasn't natural market inflation, it was a policy choice. And on top of that, aggressive immigration enforcement led to agricultural labor shortages, which boosted the price of fruit and vegetables, the very produce families like quiches needed most, by an estimated 15%.
So policies simultaneously raised the cost of food while they were fighting the programs designed to help pay for it.
Exactly. And then you look at healthcare, which is arguably the most severe affordability pressure point for the middle and working classes.
What happened there?
The decision regarding the Affordable Care Act was incredibly impactful. The administration refused to extend crucial tax credits that subsidize ACA premiums. For 24.3 million enrollees, this refusal meant their health insurance costs were poised to soar. These credits are what reduced the monthly cost of insurance for low and middle-income Americans. Refusing to extend them meant enrollees would suddenly have to bear the full premium costs themselves.
And the political consequence of that refusal.
The cruelest irony is that 3/4 of those 24.3 million people facing soaring healthcare costs live in states that overwhelmingly supported the populist movement, so-called red states. So the policy was doing worse than nothing for the affordability crisis, forcing working families in their own base to choose between expensive insurance, food, and rent.
And finally, what about housing and utilities, another major cost of living factor?
Existing federal funding for LIHEAP, that's the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, it was already inadequate. But even worse, the Department of Housing and Urban Development pursued proposed rules that threatened to reduce or eliminate rental assistance for 4 million low-income Americans. In every critical sector where the populist movement promised relief, food, health, housing, the policies enacted or pursued created new, severe financial pressure on the very working class the rhetoric claimed to serve. The populist paradox is just laid bare, a movement that appeals to the working class's anger but consistently delivers economic policy tailored for the elite. And this profound policy divergence brings us to our third and final section, the architecture of inequality. If the policies are so contradictory to the public interest and the fiscal cost of cuts like S&P are so demonstrably high, we have to look deeper at the systemic architecture. What underlying governance mechanisms ensure that policies consistently favor the rich, regardless of who is delivering the populist messaging?
Right. The root of popular financial anger, as you often see, is directed at the tax system. People know it's unfair, but they're often attacking the wrong targets.
That's because the U.S. tax system is progressive in theory, meaning higher earners should pay a higher percentage of their income, but it has become nearly flat in practice. And this isn't an accidental feature. It's the result of a concerted effort by the wealthy over decades to minimize their effective tax rates. They use what the IRS calls tax expenditures, preferential tax breaks, generous deductions, and most critically lower rates for capital gains and cuts to the estate tax. The progressive nature of the system is effectively eroded.
And this erosion of progressivity allows for popular confusion, meaning the public often attacks the very taxes that are most progressive.
Exactly. This is the critical consequence of successful elite obfuscation. The public's confusion means they attack progressive taxes like the federal income tax and especially the estate tax, which only hits the wealthiest few hundred families a year, while simultaneously tolerating regressive taxes. A regressive tax, by definition, takes a larger percentage of income from low-income families than high-income families. The most common example is the sales tax.
And for lower-income Americans, the regressive taxes are actually a bigger burden than the federal income tax.
Absolutely. For the bottom 60% of American households, the total cost of state and local sales taxes costs them more each year than their entire federal income tax liability. So the political strategy of focusing all public anger solely on the federal income tax is a brilliant, calculated form of elite obfuscation.
Could you elaborate on that? How does it make the non-rich, unwitting allies in the riches fight against progressive taxation?
Yeah. By directing all public ire toward the income tax, the tax the wealthy do pay but fight to minimize, it shifts attention away from the regressive taxes that disproportionately crush the poor. For example, tax breaks like the highly preferential treatment of capital gains income from investments, which benefits the rich overwhelmingly, are rarely targeted in political rhetoric. Meanwhile, the estate tax, which only impacts multimillionaires, is demonized as a threat to small family farms. By maintaining this focus, politicians ensure the public remains fixated on the progressive revenue streams the wealthy want eliminated, making the majority an unwitting partner in dismantling the very tax structure designed to fund social safety nets.
If that's the political tactic, how much actual power does elite influence have over Washington policymaking? I mean, do we have hard evidence?
The academic findings on policy capture are not just anecdotal, they're stunningly quantified. Studies analyzing thousands of national policy decisions show clearly that economic elites and organized business interests have a substantial independent impact on U.S. government policy, while the average citizen has little or no independent influence.
Little or no independent influence. That is a direct challenge to the fundamental ideal of representative democracy. How did researchers even quantify that power differential?
They did it by analyzing the outcomes of policy decisions versus the preferences of different income groups. The hard numbers indicate that the preferences of the wealthy, defined as the top 90th percentile of income distribution, were found to be 15 times more influential in affecting national policy outcomes than the preferences of the average American.
15 times more influential.
Yeah.
That's staggering. And this power extends beyond just influencing existing legislation, right? It's about setting the agenda.
Exactly. This power extends to shaping the political agenda itself, defining what issues policymakers will even consider and which issues are designated as non-starters. This preemptive control is key. The wealthy tend to be highly organized through lobbying groups, high-dollar campaign donations, and the funding of think tanks that generate research aligned with their economic interests. This architecture ensures that many policies supported by the majority never even reach the floor for a debate.
So if we hypothetically removed that elite opposition, what policies would Congress have already enacted? What does that policy divergence look like in real terms?
The research indicates that without the opposition of economic elites, Congress would have consistently enacted policies overwhelmingly supported by the middle class and the poor. This includes a perpetually higher minimum wage index to inflation, much more generous unemployment benefits, stricter corporate regulation, especially on polluting industries, and critically, a far more progressive tax regime than we have now. All of these are blocked by the organized preference of the wealthy.
And this systemic blockage suggests that the preferences of the wealthy elite are fundamentally misaligned with the economic needs of the general public.
They are profoundly misaligned. The wealthy are documented to be much more conservative than the general public regarding social welfare programs, healthcare, and redistribution. To give a specific example, 61% of the American public supports tax-financed national health insurance. That support drops drastically to only 32% among the wealthy. They also display much greater support for aggressively cutting programs like Social Security and various healthcare initiatives. The policy divergence is not subtle, it's systemic and deliberate.
And how does the makeup of the political class in Congress reflect and reinforce this policy divergence?
It's a critical, self-reinforcing loop. Millionaires make up only 3% of the overall U.S. population, but hold a clear majority in the House of Representatives. And in the Senate, they hold what amounts to a filibuster-proof supermajority. Research confirms that legislators who come from profit-oriented, white-collar jobs CEOs, corporate lawyers, and so on, tend to vote with business interests much more often than those with working-class or public sector backgrounds.
So the absence of working-class legislators directly translates into policies that are stingier toward the working class.
That is the direct causal link identified in the analysis. The absence of working class representation is directly associated with policies that are more favorable to businesses, social safety net programs that are stingier, protections for workers that are weaker, and economic inequality that is significantly worse. A concrete example cited is the 2001 Bush tax cuts, which did not receive a single vote from a legislator who has significant professional experience in working class jobs. The class makeup of Congress acts as a filtering mechanism for policy outcomes.
This brings us back to the ultimate paradox of the populist movement. If the system is designed to benefit the rich, and politicians are delivering tax cuts for the rich and cutting safety nets for the poor, how do right-wing politicians successively gain mass-based support from the very people they are harming economically?
That is the political calculation that sustains this architecture of inequality. They successfully use racialized rhetoric to attack progressive programs like SNAP and Medicaid, tapping into racial resentment and historical animus toward what is framed as undeserving others receiving government handouts. This rhetorical strategy gains them mass-based support, often among working-class white voters, allowing them to consolidate power. And while they are securing this mass base through identity politics, they are simultaneously fulfilling their primary economic objective, delivering massive tax cuts, reduced regulation, and other financial benefits for their wealthy, organized backers. The result is a political system where the policies critics observe literally redistribute wealth upwards, from the poor and middle class to the rich, all disguised by a powerful, distracting populist narrative.
We began this deep dive with two images that perfectly crystallize a profound policy contradiction: the desperate line for food assistance and the golden bathroom faucet. We learned that the true cost of austerity is staggeringly high, creating $14 to $20 in documented societal losses for every dollar supposedly saved on child nutrition, and that this manufactured crisis played out against a backdrop of increasing luxury and exclusive focus on wealthy donors.
Our deep dive revealed that this split screen is not an unfortunate accident of nature or simple political gridlock. It is the result of a long-term architectural shift in the tax code and governance, where the political preferences of economic elites, who consistently oppose robust social welfare spending and progressive taxation, are systematically reflected in national policy outcomes. The evidence shows the political machine, even when operating under a populist banner, possesses strong and clear incentives to maintain obfuscation, appeal to the public's generalized tax anger, and continue enacting policies that critics observe fundamentally redistribute wealth from the majority to the well-resourced few.
The true ethical challenge arising from that golden faucet and the desperate food line is recognizing that the crisis of affordability and inequality is not a result of a revenue problem or a spending problem alone, but a calculated political strategy designed to achieve specific policy outcomes that fundamentally benefit the organized, well-resourced few, despite the clear, costly consequences for the majority.